okay if I have this here.
I think it's perfectly fine.
Okay.
I'm just getting a picture. Hi everyone. Thanks for coming. Jonah, we good? All right.
I think so.
All right. Well, thanks for coming. It's kind of a dreary topic. It's not even on the 100th anniversary. It's a 100th anniversary plus 1 month. So we'll try to make it as painless as possible. I learned the ABCs with shaving cream like in kindergarten, so it might be like that. You know what I'm talking about? Like they have the
No idea.
No, it's a thing. they put the pad out, right, and they put shaving cream in there. Then it's like a tactile thing. Children learn by making the outlines of the letters. Not a single person in the crowd has ever encountered this. Megan Erickson can't be there, and she's a teacher. She would have backed me up. And she has a wonderful essay in this issue on education and childcare in 1920s Russia. But anyway, I'm glad to be here with Jonah Birch, Jacobin contributing editor, former NYU grad student, current?
Still, yeah.
Didn't you finish your dissertation?
It's complicated.
It's complicated. He's been with NYU as long as, like, you know, I don't know, Kevin Durant was with
Since
the
October of
Timberwolves.
1917.
Yeah. So we're here to talk about the new Jacobin issue, the first Red Century. You could buy it at many fine retailers, including Whole Foods. It's kind of embarrassing, but so Jonah, why don't you play point?
So, I think that there's a lot of things to talk about in the issue. I think some people have probably read a couple of articles have been posted online. Is that right? Some? Anyway, yours has.
Yeah.
And, so Bhaskar wrote a kind of a summary of the revolution and what preceded it and a little bit about its aftermath. And I think that's probably a good place to start, because it gives a bit of an overview. And it's I think it's a very good summary in some ways. Really one of the most useful things in the issue. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what it is, where you're drawing your history from. I noticed, for example, that some of your arguments remind me a lot of people might know of the historian Lars Lee, who's written a lot recently about Lenin and makes an argument that Lenin and the Bolsheviks saw themselves not so much as trying to kind of create a new kind of party or a different kind of politics, but very much within the tradition of the Second International with Karl Kautsky and people like the German Social Democrats, but trying to apply that tradition to the particular context in Russia. And I felt like you drew a lot from there and from some other sources. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
So I came to the left kind of through the Russian Revolution in many ways. When I was in the summer between 7th and 8th grade, I read Leon Trotsky's My Life, which was a terrible book. I never really liked it. But then from there, I read the Deutscher trilogy, which was, quite
Trotsky.
About Trotsky, and that was kind of my entry point to the ideas of the left. So a lot of this was kind of historical in nature. A lot of it was thinking about these things through the lens of the Russian Revolution. A lot of it was reading old texts from various groups, from Leninist groups, Trotskyist groups, and other things. So even though my politics, as I evolved, and I actually immediately, even in that period when I was in high school, end of high school, I joined the Democratic Socialists of America. So not a group that dated its tradition to the Russian Revolution or kind of the splits that happened afterwards. But I still was always familiar and compelled by it. And I don't think it's a history that we should ignore, no matter kind of what we make of what happened after, because it was the first and the first attempt to build a different order, not just kind of doses of humanities within capitalism, but it's a first attempt to build a new order entirely outside of it. So I don't think we should underestimate it. I mean, for generations, socialists used to call it, the greatest event in human history, which was grandiloquent, of course. But I think it's up there. Maybe not as good as the wheel or the fire or whatever else. But it's greatest in terms of significance. So with this piece, I tried to just synthesize a bunch of different arguments and show kind of the Bolsheviks in a context of the complex context in which they operated. So I think at the beginning, I drew heavily on Lars Lee's book, Lenin Rediscovered, and other work that put the Bolsheviks' organizational decisions within context. So in other words, the Bolsheviks were not a particularly martial party. One anecdote that I throw in there mentions the fact that Lenin had over 40 articles rejected from Pravda in just a 2 years period. And it's really absurd to think about even the leader, a leader of a small, like, not very radical organization, like, you know, Bernie Sanders getting rejected from an Our Revolution newsletter. It just would be absurd to think about it happening once. It happened 40-something times. Because, you know, these were parties that were cut through with internal divisions and debates. They were live, they were vibrant. And in many ways, the Bolsheviks were more vibrant than the German SPD and all these other parties, despite the fact they were underground. They were illegal, you know, parties. So I think part of it was explaining this kind of context and getting kind of ridding ourselves of this myth of the Bolsheviks as being a highly militarized kind of party, and talking about how democracy flourished even in the worst of these conditions. And the rest was explaining the evolution of the decisions that the Bolsheviks took between 1905 and February 1917, but even between February 1917 and October 1917, in the context of trying to make the best decision in a very difficult circumstance. And I think, you know, I describe it as ending in a tragedy just because of Stalinism, which I guess is kind of a quasi-Trotskyist a point. But I do see that as a tragedy, but it's one without many villains, because each and every one of their decisions, I think, were a lot of them were justified at the time. So I was trying to break some of these myths and trying to make the history accessible, which obviously meant synthesizing and embellishing one or two points.
But that's kind of...
There was no embellishment, by the way. That was a joke. It's proper history.
I mean, there's a lot of ways in which you could read the history of the 20th century left in general. All the different currents is something of a tragedy. Definitely, I think from Deutscher, who you're mentioning, that comes out very strongly.
The old joke is the God that failed, and I think that the Jonah Birch joke, which I'm going to put into writing in my book, but it comes from Jonah Birch, was social democracy is the God that worked for a while, then failed. Not a very good joke, but it's Jonah's joke.
Thanks for retelling it.
I think that this is really useful to think about. I mean, these are the two main currents of the workers' movement, and ultimately they failed and they didn't achieve what they set out to achieve. But in a way, they succeeded in the extent that 1/3 of the world was under the administration of self-described parties that governed in the interests of the working class, from social democratic ones to Stalinist ones to post-colonial states that were explicitly socialist. And we shouldn't underestimate what a dramatic shift this was from the 19th century and from like the way the 20th century could have worked out as. I mean, we could have lived in the 20th century in which the left wing was Christian democracy and the right wing was these military dictatorships like interwar Poland was. So I think that is extremely significant and a triumph. Like Hobsbawm has a very grandiloquent quote where he kind of says the only thing in world history similar was the Islamic, first century of Islamic conquest and expansion, and I think that fits.
Can you just talk a little bit more about? I mean, the other theme of your piece, in some ways, is that there's clearly a transition after 1917 from this very democratic party, a democratic workers' movement in which Lenin loses debates all the time, to something that's much more dictatorial, obviously very repressive in a lot of ways, and some of the sources that you draw on to talk about that. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So I mean, I think a lot of the argument was essentially that the decisions that the Bolsheviks made in the context of a civil war could have all been justified. The problem was, and obviously Rosa Luxemburg made a similar argument, was that the Bolsheviks kind of eventually came to make a virtue out of necessity. And it's not as monolithic as people say. There's constantly voices within the Bolshevik Party calling for more worker control, calling to reassess certain things. Kamenev even was criticizing, leading Bolsheviks were criticizing the Chekas, the way they operated, the impunity in which they operated. And it wasn't so much that these things were necessarily mistakes. Some of them obviously were the practice of collective punishment and whatever else, but this is a context where the white terror was just as significant. And you saw the return of mass pogroms and whatever else. So the analogy that I made that probably opens me up for lots of criticism on the left was my Lincoln analogy, and this is also
to Lincoln
a line
during the Civil War.
Lincoln during the Civil War, and along these lines, like Sam Farber wrote a very good book in 1991 called "Before Stalinism" that dealt from a revolutionary perspective, and how do we deal with these questions? What does a socialist theory of jurisprudence look like? And in many ways you can invent this thing from scratch, right? We might want to look at like principles like clear and present danger and whatnot to decide when the state can preemptively intervene and suppress speech and whatever else. So I think the problem was all these temporary measures became institutionalized, and the Bolsheviks didn't put a strong enough parentheses around what was happening.
And how much of this is about, look, this is, you talk the first successful workers' revolution in a country with 150 million peasants, an autocracy, and clearly there was some expectation that they were going to get saved by whatever happened in Germany and Western Europe, and that obviously didn't happen. How much of it was driven by that?
Yeah, I think a lot. I think partially in that it was a holding action. But the thing is, the holding action had a successful exit. And the NEP was something that was developing Russia. Industry levels had in 1921 were 1/3 1913 levels, but by 1926 they had almost completely rebounded in certain spheres, more than rebounded. And there was, obviously that was coupled with a growing political authoritarianism, but you could have imagined Russia being a semi-authoritarian, one-party state that still has lots of room for the arts and culture and still provide a degree of stability and was still a beacon to the workers' movement in the West. Something like, Russia being like a state like Cuba, was in its, in its prime, and, something that obviously those of us on the radical left might have certain criticism of it, but it's still, as far as the developing world goes, one of the most just societies, we could imagine. Maybe you disagree with that. But so I think there was that out. But I think we have to question to what extent there was actually the potential for a revolution in Germany, for example. Like whether we were at a point where we were in a moment of mass revolt, mass unrest, but to what extent there could have actually been institutionalized the creation of these proletarian governments, what extent they've been able to create a stable system of governance out of this disaster. So one thing I mentioned is that, I say the Bolsheviks focused more on the conquest of power than the exercise of power, but I think that was true across the Second International. I think all these parties kind of thought that it'd be simple, that the transition to a socialist economy would be a simple matter of accounting, like to create a planned economy and the distribution of resources. There, I think there was a simplicity or unanswered questions about what's the relation between direct Soviet democracy and parliamentary democracy. And I think a lot of these problems existed in the Second International as a whole. And if anything, the Bolsheviks were a better branch of the Second International. So one thing I cut from the piece is like, when we criticize the Bolsheviks for a excessively schematic view of the difference between poor peasants, middle peasants, and kulaks, a lot of this analysis is pure Kautskyan agricultural analysis. And so the root of the problem was in the Second International, even parts of it that would become the Social Democrats, not necessarily the Bolsheviks themselves, which might put us in in a very depressing, moment. So but the reason why
I smell a special issue on the peasant question.
the
coming
peasant
up,
question, yeah,
Kautsky versus Lenin
just
on the peasant question.
to further destroy any chance of viable
Business
market. Yeah. We'll see what the sell-through rates are like at Whole Foods for this one. The last one was an environment issue. That one been sold well. So for me though, the reason why I obviously have spent so much of my life though reading about the Russian Revolution, engaging this pedantic, with seemingly pedantic debates and whatever else, is because there's something compelling about the history, because it's a sign that a group of people. And the key about the Bolsheviks is they're not just a group of intellectuals or professional revolutionaries. These are people with that actual organic connection to a working class base. That's the reason why the Bolsheviks are able to better adapt to all the new questions that are emerging in February and October. It's not because Lenin's sitting in some perch just writing out, here's my theses, here's the direction the revolution is going to go. It's because they actually have people everywhere and they're listening to the demands at the base. And I think the idea that this group of people, this 3% of the population, whatever the Russian working class was, and let's say 55% of the 3%, were able to change the destiny of not just one country, but the entire world, the entire short century afterwards. This to me is at the core of what being a socialist is about. It's about saying that so many of the things in life, so many things in society that we take as natural are in fact not natural. They're in fact the result of political outcomes, and through conscious activity we could change them. Yeah. And for you, someone who comes from a different tradition than me politically, I would imagine you probably describe yourself as a Leninist for most of your political.
Sure.
Why did you first become engaged with these ideas? And
I don't think I can even tell you that. Do you mean? So here's the other thing that because I think that the socialist movement. I mean, look, the people who made the 1917 revolution saw themselves as continuing a tradition. They very much saw what they were doing and saw events around them, interpreted them through the lens of 1789, 1793, 1848, 1871. These different revolutionary moments over the previous century plus. And there's a way in which I think that having that historical memory, not because you're looking back for models to replicate, because of course, when they overthrew the Tsarist government, it was brought down by 200 Red Guards storming the Winter Palace. Well, it's a very different context, of course. But being able to kind of contextualize yourself and your own political activity, that seems important to me. Not that we are gonna build a mass movement in this country on the basis of everyone saying I'm a Leninist and let's repeat 1917. But unless there is some kind of political memory there, of which I think that's an important part, I think there's only so far we're gonna be able to get on the left. That's my view of things. I mean, I think one thing that comes out very strongly in this issue is that there's clearly a debate about how relevant it is even to talk about this, about October. And I know that there have been a whole series of publications that have, I'm thinking of like China Mievel's book, October, publications that have come out recently that try and deal with the history of 1917. And I think that's a question, what is the relevance of it for us today? I think that's an important question. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well,
not to put you on the spot.
No, I think the history is important and it's relevant to us on the left in particular, partially because it was a successful revolution, and we have to deal with the aftermath, both good and bad. So in other words, I think we learned valuable lessons about how difficult it is to actually administer a socialist state. I think we learned a lot of lessons about the permanence of certain political questions. So even after the primary class question is resolved, there'll still be a need, I think, for multiple parties and multiple movements. And we could I'd be in favor of saying, all right, every legal party has to agree with the the abolition of wage labor, for instance. Just like we wouldn't necessarily believe in the free speech right of an organized political party that wants to bring back slavery in the United States today. I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing for the small d, small l democratic left to say. Though, to be honest, if me and Jonah were to start a monarchist party tomorrow, I don't think there would be much popular outcry for it. But the fact is,
depends which of us was going to be king.
Right. There's Tom Brady, clearly. I mean, this fucking guy.
Talk about a beacon of socialism. I can't believe this is what gets boos from the crowd.
Yeah, we're all Drew Bledsoe people here. We all know this usurper, the House of Bledsoe. So, I think
the left can't stand a winner.
Yeah, right. That is true. Well, I'm a Yankees fan, so. So, I think this is all important, but also the idea that, a process of transformation is going to be something that I believe happens over a long, period of time. But I do differentiate that from the gradualist idea that you just slowly erode capitalism from within the capitalist system. I do think there needs to be a rupture, right? So in other words,
some kind of break, you mean?
Some sort of break, right? So I think in the United States, for instance, we see the resistance that's put up even for minor changes in the tax code, even for the battles that the ruling class will put up for the estate tax or whatever else. Imagine if we were actually challenging. We saw even in social democracy, they wouldn't even stand. Over the long term, challenges to their profitability, challenges to their ability to manage any of these things. So, fundamentally, I believe in the necessity to leave open their eyes, and that change doesn't primarily happen through electoral means. It has to happen through power in the streets, and I think that part of the revolutionary socialist tradition is still very much worth holding on to, especially if we believe that our version of socialism doesn't happen as a result of a class compromise. Our version of socialism is when the rules of the game is fundamentally changed, so that there is just one class that abolishes itself. The classic. Whereas I think on the left
and then
today,
you're capable of building institutions that express a different kind of class interests and a different vision of how society should function.
Right. And that we could build these institutions within capitalism. We can start to build them, right?
Yeah.
Like a mass party, what the Bolsheviks had, their organs of publications, their organs of actually being in every working class district in Russia. And obviously, it's a small percentage of Russia's population as a whole, but they were still in engagement with several million people, way more than the left and the Western world today can say. So I think all these lessons are important. But I draw this in many ways with the same reason why I pay a lot of attention, more so than a lot of people on the left, to social democracy.
Sure.
And obviously you are a rare bird.
I want to be on a left that can learn lessons from 1917 in Russia and 1976 in Sweden.
Right, and
both.
that's your area of study, is not Sweden, but France and the welfare state.
Yep.
And because in many ways I think we should get rid of the division of 1917. The divisions happened later, and just say that there was different experiments in working class government and working class parties and working class movements, and we have negative and positive lessons for both of them. In social democracy, we saw how if you're pursuing a strategy of patience, it in the end can draw you close to the nation and the class that you were created to oppose. And if you don't really take structural power away from that class, all your gains, or a lot of them, could be eroded. Because obviously social democracy grew when capitalism was stable and when capitalism was prosperous. So that when the right of social democracy said, we need to crush down revolts in 1919 and we need to restabilize the system, it wasn't the perfidy of some bad misleaders of the working class, or whatever the cliches are.
The betrayal narrative, as people put it.
Yeah, it was very rational from a certain standpoint. And when the Bolsheviks saw a situation of instability and they decided to just break with the system even if they didn't know what was going to happen next, that was also rational too. I think what I deal with is the dilemma of those of us kind of between the two traditions had no actual program, right? There is no, there was, as far as I can see it, no, Kotskian kind of like decision, right? Either you're going
Third
to
way. The radical center.
or the Austro-Marxists. They didn't have, there was no third way really. Either you choose to restabilize the system and make gains for workers within the system, or you choose the kind of the leap into the unknown. And I think that's an interesting challenge for us. Like, what would this kind of this second and a half international, or what would these decisions make today? And that's also why, I mean, unlike you, I believe, we'll soon find out. I look at the Euro-communist tradition, or at least the Italian Communist Party, let's say, and I think that yes, at a theoretical level, at all these sorts of levels, there's all sorts of deficiencies. But what they were trying to do is they were unable to participate in the governance of a bourgeois state because the capitalist parties and the pressure from NATO and the U.S. prevented them from taking part in these governments after the late 1940s. So as a result, they were forced to adopt this very slow, patient strategy of accumulating class forces, of making a difference in cultural spheres, of building up support that mirrored in many ways, to me, the experience of the Second International. The problem was it was all, war of position and no possibility of war of, maneuver. There was no possibility of them actually taking power. They didn't really have that aspiration. But to me, that example, too, is a significant example in the West of working class, politics.
So there's a way in which this is, now we're kind of talking about the legacy of, and the Euro-communist tradition of these communist parties in Western Europe that sort of broke with Moscow on a complicated basis in the 1960s and 1970s, sort of were inspired by the Sino-Soviet split, but definitely did not identify with the Chinese.
Except for Albania.
Okay, except for the Albanians, yeah. Experience and our, and that, I think the question there is whether it's some key moments of kind of radicalization and leftward turn within the class, those parties played a conservatizing role. And that I think a lot of people would argue that in the Italian movement, for example, in the years after the hot autumn of 1969, when you saw these factory movements developing and really through the 1970s, that there's clearly an argument that the Italian Communist Party kind of tried to put the brakes on things because they were very, very interested in being allowed to form a coalition government with the Christian Democrats. And that was kind of the goal. And other people will say, well, the Spanish party, another party that took this turn, played a kind of role in this very conservative transition in Spain in the late 70s from Francoism by kind of negotiating the terms of that in a way that left a lot of the institutions of Francoism intact. Yeah. Now, other people argue, oh, what are you going to do? You know what I mean? Look at it, it's easy for you to say in retrospect. And I think that's a debate to have, an important debate to have. Definitely, there is a larger question about the kind of the communist parties that emerged from this moment of radicalization, of, if not revolution all over the world, certainly you saw in the years after 1917 some real revolts and the formation of new parties and that split from the old Second International parties. The question of kind of their legacy and what role they would play over the next 60 years, that's one that certainly lots of people have debated on the left, and that there's a lot to say about, right?
So after, let's say, we didn't really talk about Stalinism, right? So first of all, I guess definitionally, when I discuss Stalinism, I use it in two ways, right? One is if I want to be provocative with some of my friends that are kind of from the official communist movement, I'll just say, everything Stalinism from like 1927 to 1991 or whatever. But realistically for me, it's a brief period in the 30s and 40s where there's breakneck collectivization that is done in a brutal way. There's all these kind of transformations. There's millions of deaths, whatever else. And then what happened after is an authoritarian system. But generally, in my view, Russia from the Khrushchev era until until Gorbachev is probably the best Russia has ever been as far as having stable stable growth, prosperity, peace. Obviously political repression, a lack of a free civil society, and whatever else. But a prison state smaller per capita than our prison state today in the U.S.
That's not saying that much, is it?
No, it's not saying that much. But I think it is important to put into context. So when people talk 100 years from now about American democracy today, are they going to put a big asterisk around it?
I take your
just
point.
on the basis of So how do you interpret? I don't know, Stalinism, start, end date?
I'm the wrong person to ask about definitional, some of those debates. Definitely, I think that the hopes that inspired people in 1917 clearly were not fulfilled. And by the end of the 30s, a lot of people who had made the revolution were dead, or had been eaten by the revolution itself. And that, those kind of, aren't we still dealing with the legacy of people saying, well, if that's what socialism is to you, is that really what we want in the rest of the world? Hasn't that been...
Well, the Barcelona thing, I like the idea that if you go to Spain today, you'll still see, tons of people who have Republican flags, and, depending where, like in Barcelona, still kind of draw very deeply on this socialist tradition. So it's like 3 months of real socialism, like in the 30s there, left more of a legacy, when if you go to, like, Ukraine today, which is enveloped in political conflict, there's very few red flags in either side, right? Even in the East. So 3 months of real socialism versus like 50 years of like a fairly stagnant system.
What about, so Daniel Finn also wrote an article in here about Soviet foreign policy, and I wondered what your thoughts were about that, where he says, look, it's a mixed bag. Lots of people who were struggling against colonialism or against the U.S. Vietnam, obviously, is something that comes to mind, really relied on the Soviets for support. And then there are other contexts like Ethiopia, and not to get into the weeds, where they played a very bad role.
So this is one place where I've always, despite the fact, coming from a democratic socialist tradition, I've always been soft on the Soviet Union. This is partially because my family, background, my parents, loved, Castro, Tito, Gaddafi, but but part of that made sense. When if your kid grew up poor in like a place like India, like my dad was, you open your textbook and it's like donated from the people of the peoples of the Yugoslavia or whatever. It's kind of and I think that reflected an actual contribution. And I think despite the repression at home, I think in general, I don't think we could reduce the foreign policy of the Soviet Union to just power politics or imperialism, or at least it's more complicated than that. So in a way, if I really wanted to go push this to the extreme, I would say that, what's the biggest German military operation, post 1945? It's not Kosovo, actually.
Afghanistan, or they're in Afghanistan?
10,000 German military advisors were in Angola in the 1970s. So there's something to say, as repressive as East Germany was or whatnot, that the literal sons and daughters of SS soldiers were helping to bring down fighting South African troops, or advising military technical advisors, and tanks created in East German factories were being used to that end in Africa. So I think there's that, and of course there's particularly the Cuban role, which is just irrational at the level of just, if they're a power or looking after their interests, some of the actions in Africa. Then of course, on the other hand, there's the fact that those same Soviet troops that portions of the Western left would say are explicitly just liberators, like actually used chemical weapons in Afghanistan, used brutal repression and helped aid brutal repression against an Eritrean liberation movement that was actually a pro-Moscow Eritrean liberation movement that they had funded before. It was actually much closer to Moscow than the Derg dictatorship was. Yeah. So obviously there's
Ethiopia.
Yeah, in Ethiopia. So obviously there's all these kind of caveats, but I think looking at the history, at least just limiting it to foreign policy, post-1991, the U.S. has just been able to do an incredible amount of harm globally, and the destruction of the Soviet Union has just been destabilizing. But at some level, that's the difficulty on the left, because I think there's something profoundly not leftist about just adopting kind of realpolitik of viewing these things like, oh, a couple thousand Eritreans might die, but it's in this grand scheme of whatever. I mean, if you're on the left, you probably came to the left for a moral and ethical reason. And I consider myself, despite everything I just said for the last 2 minutes, a third campus for that reason, right? Because simply we need to like as an opposition movement, look more critically than I think a lot of the left was capable of doing. There was the Spartacists literally would hand out things. They still kind of do. They're still like not living it down where it said "All hail the Red Army," right? All hail, is it all hail?
I think so.
Yeah. Which is, first of all, just ridiculous language. Like, who the fuck says "all hail"? In the 20th century, it's ridiculous. But anyway. So
this panel is degenerating. We're talking about the Spartacist. No.
Was that a pun?
So I'm just wondering if we can sum up a little bit, because I feel like we've covered a lot of ground in a very quick while. And it almost feels now like.
So I want you on the Soviet foreign policy, though.
Well, I don't want to be put on the. I think that in lots of ways there was a.
Give us a Mao, like 60% good, 40% bad. Give us a percentage.
I'm not going to be pinned down to a percentage. Maybe afterwards during the party we can come up with an exact percentage. I think there was a way in which, that it's very, even if you look at the U.S. Communist Party, there's been all this literature over the last quarter century that says in the 1930s, tens of thousands of people, joined the Communist Party, and they had real roots in workplaces, and these people were not just dupes of Moscow, and then on the other hand, there's a way in which, and there's some discussion of that in here. Some of the policies that those parties pursued were very conservatizing, at some key moments, and that's a complicated history to talk about. No,
yeah.
That's a way of dodging your question.
Yeah, it is, because normally, the whole fun of you don't do top fives. You don't just be like, all right, top five, greatest,
Only
whatever.
after another.
No, only after drinks, not on camera. Yeah.
So
I'm all about top fives. I'll be like top 5 greatest Albanians of the 1990s. I got lists. I have so many lists.
Can you name 5 Albanians of the 1990s?
I'll end up naming someone from Kosovo or something. I'll create some scandal internationally if I do that.
We're almost there.
Yeah.
Just push a little harder. So in terms of summing up, it does feel like. There was a moment 40 years ago during the 70s when both social democracy and the revolutionary left in large chunks of the world saw themselves as on the ascendance. And there was some hope that both, that a kind of radical turn in social democracy or the growth of the far left in workplaces and, certainly throughout Western Europe, for example, that offered the promise of, in the not too distant future, some rupture, some break with capitalism, some real transition. And obviously it feels now like we're not near that, and that we're starting a little bit from the beginning. And you see things that, of course, people are incredibly inspired by Corbyn or Sanders, and then on the other hand, we lack those kinds of roots on the ground that the left once had. What in this context is what's the key takeaway from 1917 what should we take? Whether it's about, not just in terms of how to organize now, but in terms of kind of a larger vision of where eventually we would like to go. What's the lesson to?
Well, yeah, you're like.
I'm really putting you on the spot.
I think the it's hard to know whether you're at the beginning, middle, or end of a story.
I hope we're not at the end, because I don't think that would be good for us.
Well, yes, it wouldn't be good. Though I think because of the efforts of the workers' movement, because of the efforts of progressive movements, we're not living in the worst of all possible worlds. We're living in something like 6 out of 10.
In the multiverse.
I could name 5. Along with my 5 Albanians, I could name 5 possible worlds worse than this. But, so there was a time when you could go into a working class district in a place like Italy and all like Spain and throughout much of the advanced capitalist world. And you would know you're in a working class area because
they would have pictures of Lenin on the wall.
They would sometimes have pictures of Lenin. They still do in like Brazil and in India and
really?
Places like it's still a current. You would go there and there would be a certain distinct culture. There'd be certain newspapers they would read. In the main, 80% of those people might vote for a party that described itself for a social democratic or labor party that at least in principle in their bylaws and their constitution said that their aim was socialism, said their aim was the erosion of capital. And for those of us on the far left, we could easily imagine saying, all right, this is the base for our politics. And they already say they're for some other form of socialism. Yeah. We need to engage with them and try to bring them over to a more radical vision towards something that's actually more about confrontation and not just settle for a class compromise, but settle for a deeper democratic horizon. And we still failed at this, by the way. We got like 3% of them. That was, but they were there. Now it seems like there is no. It's not clear where the social base for our politics is. In other words, sociologically, the base still exists. There's still the vast majority of people have to work for a living. The vast majority of people don't like their jobs. The vast majority of people feel like they're getting screwed by the system. The vast majority of people, I think, are discontent. And our goal as socialists, and I think the takeaway is, we need to make collective action a viable choice. So, and I think that is one of the lessons from 1917 that people have took to the extreme, and also a lesson from the Cuban Revolution and all these other revolutions is kind of a Promethean lesson. The fact that small, disciplined, coordinated people can build a mass following and can just change the tide of history by themselves. And of course, we know the actual history is far more complicated than that.
Difficult, yeah.
But I do think it reminds us of the fact that right now our goal is to recohere a militant minority in American political life. We need a layer of people who are organizers in their workplace, in their communities, who could speak to people about a broad ecumenical vision of what a just society would look like. And we know that if we make collective action for enough people a viable choice, some of them might pursue it, and that might create a spark, and that might create the basis for renewed working class politics. And I think it's that we need to take seriously. So, in other words, my balance has always been taking seriously the challenge of cadre building and doing things like debating 1917 while not kind of doing the task of just burning each other out by being, we just need to do this in 10 years and just us and us alone can do it. But I just remain very confident in the idea that, you can't have this much suffering, this much poverty, this much needless inequity amid plenty for forever, right? Eventually, every single ruling class in the history of the world has been toppled. And I think that's going to be the case until there's no longer a ruling class. I'm not positive anymore that whatever movement that does this toppling will call itself necessarily socialist, will follow.
Really? You're not positive about that?
I'm not positive about that, but I am positive that there will be a resistance. The only challenge is, and the big dilemma is, can we take the small acts of micro-resistance that are still going to happen? Just anytime you put one person in a subordinate position to another person, another group of people, there's going to be these micro-acts of resistance. And can we aggregate them together into a broad-based political movement that can challenge for power at the broader kind of state and now international levels? I think that's an open question for now, but at the very least, I think we should maintain some sort of moral clarity about the vision of building a world with that class. Yeah, the world that we want, but also beyond that, I think the difficulties in achieving it, right? So I think that's one thing where Lenin and the Bolsheviks can be forgiven because they were first. But if we jump into, if we think that overnight we could kind of make a leap forward. That was not a pun. Yeah, but no one would have picked up on it as a potential pun. All right, I'm done. All right, good night.
And I think on that note,
thank you all for
Thank
coming.
you.
Take care.
That was anticlimactic.